Naomi knew what she was. She was invisible by design, a woman shaped by years of practice into something the world could look past without guilt. A ghost in plain sight, moving through rooms she would never be invited to sit down in. Tonight at the Harrington Estate's annual legacy dinner, she was invisible in white linen, a uniform chosen not for her, but for the way it would disappear against the tablecloths. She moved between the guests with the precision of long habit, her silver tray steady, her face composed into the particular blankness that kept tips generous and comments sparse. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse orchids and aged cognac, a heavy sweetness that coated the inside of her chest like something she was not supposed to breathe. Conversation floated up from the candlelit tables in bright, brittle fragments. Laughter too loud, compliments too polished, the sound of people performing wealth for one another with the urgency of those afraid the performance might end. She did not belong here. She had never pretended otherwise. Belonging was a different kind of currency, and Naomi Carter had learned young that some accounts are never opened in your name, no matter how long you stand at the window. She was refilling a glass near the east wall when she heard it. Not shouted, not even particularly directed at her, just dropped into the ambient noise the way certain words always were, casually, because cruelty is most efficient when it requires no effort. Biological failure. A woman in emerald at the nearest table, not even turning her head, speaking to her companion as if reading from a list. I heard she can't have children. Tragic, really. Some women just aren't built for anything lasting. Naomi's hand did not shake. It never shook. She set the decanter down with the same quiet control she had been setting things down with for 26 years, straightened her spine by exactly the degree necessary, and continued moving. She did not know that on the far side of the room, a man had gone completely still. He was not watching the table. He was not watching the woman in emerald. He was watching the one in white linen. Watching the way she absorbed the blow without breaking stride, the way her chin lifted almost imperceptibly, the way her shoulders carried a dignity that had nothing to do with the room's approval and everything to do with the strength it would never be able to name. Ryuichi Kuroda had spent his entire life in rooms full of people performing for his attention. He had not been genuinely interested in a single one of them in years. He was interested now. The dinner had been arranged with the kind of precision that money makes possible and desperation makes necessary. Naomi had worked enough of these events to read the architecture of them, the seating chart that was never accidental, the flowers chosen to signal prosperity, the way certain guests were positioned like chess pieces around a table whose real game had nothing to do with the food. Tonight's game was the Harrington daughter. Naomi saw it before the first course was cleared. Vivian Harrington had been placed to Ryuichi Kuroda's left with the careful deliberateness of a woman being gift-wrapped. She was beautiful in the way that serious money produces, effortlessly maintained, precisely educated, fluent in the language of rooms like this one. Her gown was the deep blue of old authority. Her smile was a studied, gracious thing that she aimed at Ryuichi like an instrument she had practiced for years. He received it the way a man receives weather, noting it, unmoved by it. Naomi watched from the periphery as she moved through her rounds, refilling glasses that did not need refilling, close enough to observe without existing. She recognized the particular tension at that end of the table, the way Harrington Sr. leaned slightly forward in his chair, the way Vivian's posture was a fraction too composed, the way everything in the room was quietly, collectively holding its breath. Ryuichi spoke very little. When he did, his voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. He was courteous to Vivian in the way that a closed door is courteous, present, solid, and offering no way through. When Harrington Sr. finally made the proposal explicit, some elegant, rehearsed phrasing about cementing their partnership through family, the table went very still. Vivian's smile held with the determination of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was the answer to every question a room like this could ask. Ryuichi set down his glass. No. The word was not unkind. It was simply final, the way a horizon is final. Not cruel, not negotiable, not the beginning of a conversation. The room did not know what to do with it. Harrington Sr. laughed first, reflexively, the way men laugh when they are certain they have misheard. He began to speak, something about the families, the opportunity, Vivian's considerable, but Ryuichi had already stopped listening. His attention had shifted with the unhurried certainty of a man who does not explain his decisions to anyone. Harrington scrambled. Vivian's smile finally cracked just at the edges, just enough for Naomi to see the girl underneath it, who had been promised this moment her entire life. Naomi looked away out of instinct, out of the private courtesy she extended to everyone who was quietly breaking. When she looked back up, Ryuichi Kuroda was looking directly at her, not past her, not through her, at her. He did not stand dramatically, he did not announce himself or push back his chair with any deliberate force. He simply arose, the way a tide rises, without urgency, without question, as though the movement had always been inevitable and the rest of the room was only now catching up to what the water already knew. He crossed toward her. The crowd did not part for him the way it does in stories, cleanly and cinematically, like a sea obeying a command. It stumbled, it shifted, and recalibrated and stepped aside with the slightly panicked adjustment of people who have not planned to be in the way of something and were only now discovering that they were. A woman in burgundy satin turned too quickly and sloshed champagne against her wrist. A man in a gray suit took one look at the direction of Ryuichi's gaze and simply moved, the way you move from a window when the weather changes. Naomi had nowhere to move. She was against the east wall with a tray in her hands and 20 years of professional composure standing between her and the particular terror that was spreading through her chest like cold water finding its level. She told herself he was walking towards someone behind her. She told herself this even as the space between them closed and the room's ambient noise dropped by half and there was no one behind her, had never been anyone behind her, and she had known it the moment his eyes found hers. He stopped, close enough that she could see the gold embroidery at his cuff, a coiled dragon, precise and unhurried, like everything else about him. He was taller than the room had suggested, still in a way that was not passive but concentrated, the stillness of something that has chosen not to move rather than something that cannot. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. His name had moved through the room ahead of him all evening the way names like his always do, in lowered voices and careful glances, in the particular deference of people who understand, instinctively, where the real power in a room is seated. He looked at her. Not at the uniform, not at the tray, not at the careful blankness she wore for rooms like this one. At her. With the same quality of attention she had watched him give to nothing else all evening. Then he said, quietly in a voice meant only for her, "I would like to speak with you." 6 words. She would remember it later as 4, because the first 2, "I would," felt less like language and more like something structural shifting beneath her feet, the way the ground announces an earthquake, not with noise, but with a wrongness in the soles of your shoes. The tray was still in her hands. She became aware of it distantly, the way you become aware of something you have been holding so long you forgot it had weight. She looked up at him and said nothing, but she did not look away. Harrington Sr. moved fast for a man who had spent the evening performing ease. He was across the room before Ryuichi had finished speaking, his hand finding Ryuichi's arm with the presumptuous familiarity of a man who believed money conferred permission. His laugh was the same reflexive sound as before, but tighter now, strained at the edges like fabric pulled past its thread count. "Mr. Kuroda, forgive me. I think there's been some confusion. She's on staff." He said it the way you explain a child's mistake, gently, with the implicit suggestion that no real harm had been done and everyone could return to their places. "Whatever you need, I assure you Vivian is far better positioned to." "I am not confused," Ryuichi said. 3 words. Harrington's hand dropped. The room had gone the particular quiet of people who are pretending not to listen while listening with every nerve in their bodies. Vivian stood a few feet back, her composure reassembled into something harder and colder than the performance from dinner. Her eyes moved to Naomi with the focused displeasure of a woman who has been publicly passed over and intends to make someone pay for the geometry of it. It was Vivian who said it. Naomi would remember that. Not a stranger, not a whisper from the back of the crowd. A woman looking directly at her, voice clear and deliberate, and shaped like a gift being offered to the room. She can't even have children. She's infertile. Everyone in this circle knows it. A small pause precisely placed. She has nothing to give a man like you. She is, quite literally, a biological failure. The word landed the way it always landed. Not loudly, just completely. Naomi felt it move through her the way cold moves through a room when a window is opened in winter. Total, immediate, intimate. Her chin lifted. Her hands, still holding the tray, did not shake. They never shook. But something behind her sternum went very, very still. Ryushi turned to look at Vivian. The turn itself was enough for her to step back by half a measure. The Kuroda legacy, he said, in the same low, even register he used for everything, has never lived in a womb. He let the silence after it do its work before he continued. It has lived in the unbreakable, in those who have been given every reason to collapse and have chosen, without applause and without an audience, not to. His gaze returned to Harrington Sr. Your daughter has never been tested. She has only ever been cushioned. I do not say this as an insult. I say it as an observation. They are not the same woman. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. What he produced was not large, a pendant on a fine platinum chain, a deep green jade carved into the shape of a dragon mid-flight, worn smooth at the edges by generations of hands. He held it for a moment, then looked at Naomi. Not with tenderness, with certainty, which was something rarer and more permanent than tenderness. May I? He said quietly. It was the first time he had asked her anything. The courtesy of it, after everything, nearly undid her completely. She managed a single nod. He stepped behind her, the chain settled cool and solid against her collarbone. The room watched in absolute silence as Ryushi Kuroda fastened the Kuroda matriarch's pendant around the throat of a woman in a white linen uniform, and in doing so, rendered every other woman in the room invisible. The night air outside the Harrington estate was clean and cold, in the way that autumn air is clean, honestly, without the performance of the room she had just left. Naomi stood on the stone steps with the pendant cool against her throat and her tray, finally, mercifully, no longer in her hands. She had set it down on a side table on the way out without thinking, muscle memory making decisions, while her rest of her was still catching up to the last 20 minutes of her life. Ryushi stood a few feet away, giving her space she hadn't asked for and apparently didn't need to ask for. He had simply understood it was required and left it there, the way he seemed to understand most things, quietly, without announcement. He turned to look at Naomi. The question had been building since the moment he crossed the room, and it was not a soft question. It had edges. Why me? And I don't mean the version of that question that needs a flattering answer. I mean, what do you actually want, from me specifically? He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she recognized the pause. Not the pause of someone assembling a lie, but of someone deciding how much of the truth to give, and then deciding on all of it. I want to tell you what I saw, he said, before I answer anything else. She waited. You were insulted 3 times before dinner was served. Once by the woman in burgundy near the window, once by the man who didn't move his chair when you needed to pass, once by the word someone used loudly enough to be certain you heard it. He said it plainly, without softening it. You absorbed all 3. You did not become them. You kept moving, kept working, kept your dignity so intact that I found myself wondering how long you had been practicing that particular form of survival. Naomi said nothing. The accuracy of it sat in her chest like a stone. I have spent my entire adult life, Ryuji continued, surrounded by people who want proximity to what I am. They want protection, influence, the shelter of my name. They offer me things they believe I require, bloodlines, connections, performances of suitability. A pause. Everyone in that room wanted something from me tonight. Every single person. His eyes held hers steadily. You wanted your shift to end. That was all. You were not performing for me. You were not even aware of me until I made myself impossible to ignore. Something about the honesty of it was more disarming than any tenderness could have been. A person who wants nothing from you, he said, cannot be leveraged against you, cannot be turned, cannot be bought into betrayal. He was quiet for a moment. I have been looking for someone I could trust with my name for a long time. Trust, Miss Carter, is not built on compatibility. It is built on character under pressure. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the room, not constructing something, not imagining a future version of her, simply seeing the one standing in front of him. I saw yours tonight, he said, every part of it. She told Ryuichi the morning after the Harrington dinner that there was someone he would need to meet before she would agree to anything. She said it without apology and without softening it into a request, because it was not a request, it was a condition. He said simply, "Tell me when." James Carter lived in a narrow house in a quiet neighborhood that had never been fashionable and had never tried to be. The porch light was on when they arrived, which meant he had been awake, which meant Naomi had called ahead, which meant she had already told him enough that he felt the porch light was necessary. Ryuichi noted all of this and said nothing. James opened the door before they knocked. He was not a large man, but he had the particular quality of stillness that Naomi carried too. Ryuichi recognized it now as something learned, something passed between them like a dialect spoken only inside one household. James looked at Ryuichi the way a man looks at weather he has been warned about and has decided to assess for himself. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said, not warmly, honestly. They sat at a kitchen table with coffee that James poured without asking whether anyone wanted it. The room was clean and unadorned in a way that spoke of a man who had always had exactly what he needed and had never confused that with having less than enough. James asked his questions without preamble. What Ryuichi's intentions were, what his world would mean for Naomi's daily safety, whether he understood what she had already survived, and what it would mean to add the weight of his name to the weight she already carried. He asked about the nature of the clan, about enemies, about the specific and non-theoretical dangers that accompanied a life in Ryuichi's proximity. Ryuichi answered every question. He did not minimize, he did not redirect. When a question required an answer that did not reflect well on the life he led, he gave that answer anyway, plainly, and let it sit on the table between them without dressing it. James was quiet for a long moment after the last question. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "She doesn't know how to let people stay," James said finally, not to Ryuichi, but in the particular way of a man thinking aloud about someone he has watched for a long time. "She'll test you. She won't mean it as a test. She'll just keep waiting for you to leave, and every day you don't will confuse her a little more until one day it won't." He looked up. "The question I'm really asking is whether you have the patience for a woman who doesn't yet believe she deserves what you're offering." "Yes," Ryuichi said. No elaboration, no qualification, just the word, carrying all its weight. He studied him for a long moment, then he nodded, once, slowly, not the nod of a man who had been convinced, but of a man who had seen enough to decide. He reached across the table and refilled Ryuichi's coffee. It was the most sacred thing he knew how to offer. She had expected to be dazzled. She had prepared herself against it, specifically, the way you prepare against a known weakness, consciously, in advance, with a firm internal speech about what wealth actually was, and what it cost, and who paid that cost. She had worked inside it long enough to know its grammar. The marble and the silence and the staff who moved like ghosts through rooms they would never sit in. She knew it all. She had been all of it. What she had not prepared for was the quietness. Ryuichi's home was not a performance. That was the first thing she noticed and could not stop noticing. There were no rooms that existed purely to impress, no art hung at angles calculated for admiration. The spaces were large and considered, and filled with the particular atmosphere of a place where someone actually lived. Books left open at their spines, a half-finished cup of tea on a windowsill, a bonsai on the study table that had clearly been tended that morning. It was a house that did not need her approval and had never sought it. She waited in those first weeks for the architecture of it to reveal itself, for the catch, for the version of this that made sense inside the framework she had spent 26 years building, the one where good things arrived with conditions attached, and the conditions were always, eventually, the point. It did not reveal itself, because it was not there. He did not crowd her. He did not fill every silence with himself the way people do when they are performing generosity rather than practicing it. He simply made space and then left the space there, unfilled, available, hers to use or not use as she needed. When she wanted quiet, there was quiet. When she appeared in the kitchen at 6 a.m, because old habits do not dissolve overnight, there was coffee already made, the way she had mentioned once in passing that she took it. She had not mentioned it again. He had not mentioned that he remembered. That was what undid her, not the pendant, not the declaration in front of the Harrington room, not any of the large, public, irrefutable gestures. It was the small, private, unremarkable ones, the ones that required attention rather than resources, that could not be delegated or purchased or performed for an audience, the ones that proved he had been listening on the days she had not known she was being heard. She caught herself one evening in the 3rd week, sitting in the window seat of the East Room with a book she was not reading, watching the last of the light move across the garden. And she realized, with the slow surprise of someone finding solid ground after a long time in water, that she had not spent the day waiting for something to go wrong. She had simply spent the day. The armor did not fall. It was not dramatic enough for that. It just grew. Quietly, unnecessary, like a coat she kept reaching for on a morning that had already turned warm. She did not know he was there. That was the only reason it happened the way it did. The only reason any of it came out at all, because Naomi had spent 2 years being very careful about where and when and in front of whom she allowed herself to come undone, and the answer to all 3 had always been nowhere, never, and no one. She was in the garden. Late afternoon, the light going amber and long across the stone path. She had come out with no particular purpose, which was itself still new enough to feel faintly illicit. The idea of being somewhere without a reason, without a task, without anything to justify the space she was occupying. She had been sitting on the low bench near the far wall for perhaps 20 minutes when it came, the way grief always comes when you have kept it waiting too long, without warning and without proportion, rising up through some unguarded moment like water through a crack that has always been there. She said it out loud, not loudly, almost experimentally, the way you press a bruise to confirm it is still there. Biological failure. The words sat in the garden air and meant everything they had always meant, and also, out here, away from the room where they had been weaponized, they sounded like what they actually were. Someone else's sentence, handed to her like a verdict she had never been allowed to appeal. She thought about the doctor's office, the particular fluorescence of it, the way the word infertile had been delivered with clinical gentleness, as though the gentleness changed what it was. The way she had driven home afterward and sat in her car outside James's house for 40 minutes because she could not decide whether she was allowed to grieve something she had never been certain she wanted. She had never decided. She had simply moved forward because moving forward was the only direction she knew. Her eyes were wet before she realized she was crying. She did not sob. She had forgotten how. She simply sat with the tears running silently down her face in the amber light, grieving for the first time, without an audience and without a time limit. Naomi? His voice was quiet and came from a few feet behind her, near the garden door. He had not approached, he had simply been there and then spoken, because the alternative was leaving without acknowledging what he had witnessed, and that, she would understand later, was something he refused to do. She turned, saw his face, braced for the pity. It did not come. "The people who gave you that word," he said, moving slowly to stand near the bench, not sitting, not crowding, "were not describing you. They were describing what they needed you to be." He was quiet for a moment. They needed you to be less, so they could continue to believe they were more. That is not a diagnosis. That is a confession. The tears kept coming. She stopped trying to prevent them. "They told you that you had failed at being a woman," he said. "What they meant was that you had failed to be useful to them. Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing." She looked at him for a long time in the fading light. Something that had been load-bearing inside her for 2 years shifted quietly, like a wall that had been holding up nothing all along. The weeks had stopped feeling like a trial she was passing. That was how she knew something had genuinely changed, not in him, but in her. The waiting had ended, not with a decision or a declaration, but with the quiet accumulation of ordinary days that arrived and departed without extracting anything from her. And she had simply, gradually, stopped bracing for the ones that hadn't come yet. They had developed a life together the way lives actually develop, without design or announcement. Evenings where they read in the same room for hours without speaking. Mornings where the kitchen held both of them comfortably, moving around each other with the easy spatial awareness of people who have learned the geometry of sharing a space without surrendering it. She had started cooking on Sundays, not because anyone asked, but because she wanted to, which was a distinction that still felt new and worth noticing. He was working late one Thursday when she brought tea to his study and stayed, sitting in the chair near the window while he finished whatever required finishing. She was not waiting for him. She was simply there. At some point, he set down his pen and looked at her across the room with an expression she had learned to read by now, the one that meant he had been considering something for longer than the moment suggested. "You have made me careful with something I had stopped being careful with." She looked at him. "What?" "Myself." He said it without drama, in the same plain register he used for everything that mattered most. "I had become very efficient at the work of my life and very careless with the life inside it. You have changed that. I don't think you meant to. I think it is simply what you do, by being who you are in proximity to people who are paying attention." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not the composed, careful smile she had brought into rooms for years, like a piece of professional equipment, but something quieter and more genuine and slightly wondering. The smile of a woman who is beginning, cautiously, to believe that good things do not require a hidden invoice. "That might be the most Ryuichi Kuroda way anyone has ever said something like that," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. Almost. James came that Saturday. Naomi made rice and braised short ribs from the recipe James had taught her in a narrow kitchen 20 years ago, the one that took most of the afternoon and made the whole house smell like something that had always been home. James arrived with a bottle of wine he had clearly researched and would never admit to researching. Ryuichi met him at the door. They ate at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. The kitchen table, with its ordinary light and its mismatched serving spoons, and James's laugh, which was large and unguarded and filled the room completely. Ryuichi laughed once too, quietly, genuinely, at something James said about Naomi at 15. She covered her face with one hand and felt, with a fullness that had no adequate name, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Kuroda clan gathered in a room that had witnessed 100 years of decisions, and the room knew it. The walls were dark lacquered wood, the kind that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. The elders sat in a long, formal arrangement, 7 men and 2 women whose combined age represented more accumulated power than most governments could claim. They had been told only that Ryuichi wished to present someone. They had not been told who. The not knowing had produced, in the hours before his arrival, the particular atmosphere of old authority preparing to be displeased. Naomi stood beside Ryuichi at the threshold and felt the weight of the room the way you feel a change in pressure, physically, in the chest, in the steadying of breath. She had stood in rooms that did not want her before. She knew how to hold herself inside them. Ryuichi entered without ceremony and without deference, which was itself a message. He did not ask for the room's approval. He had never asked for anything from a room in his life, and he did not begin now. He stood before the assembled elders and spoke in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man delivering fact. He told them about the foster system, about a girl given a name by a man who chose her when choosing was not required, and what that kind of love builds in a person who receives it young enough to be shaped by it. He told them about the work, the years of it, unglamorous and consistent, the particular integrity of a woman who shows up and does not complain and does not perform. He told them about the diagnosis, and he said the word they had used for her, biological failure, plainly, so the room could hear what had been leveled at her and measure it against the woman standing before them. He told them about the dinner, the pendant, the way she had stood in that garden and grieved privately and honestly, and then kept living, because keeping living was what she did. He told them she was the strongest foundation his legacy had ever stood on, not despite what she had survived, because of how she had survived it. The room was very still. He reached for the pendant at her throat. She had worn it every day since the Harrington dinner, and by now its weight felt like her own. Unclasped it, held it for a moment, and then refastened it with the same quiet ceremony as the first time. Her name, he said to the room, is Naomi Carter. She will carry the Kuroda name forward, not in her body. He let the silence sit. In everything she is. He spoke her full name then, both names together, in the formal register reserved for Kuroda declarations. The sound of it moved through the room like something structural settling into place. One by one, beginning with the eldest, the elders bowed their heads. Naomi stood straight and still in the dark room, the pendant cool and solid against her throat, and felt the exact moment the word failure finished echoing and did not come back. She was not an empty vessel. She was not a biological failure. She was not a ghost in someone else's story or a burden someone had stopped pretending to bear. She was Naomi Carter, and a dynasty had just spoken her name like a foundation.